Here's a little background about our presenter. Art historian Dennis Raverty specializes in work from the period between the World Wars. His first book, Struggle Over the Modern, was published in 2005. His articles and criticism have appeared in Art in America, Art Journal, and Art Papers, where he was a contributing editor, as well as other publications. He authored 4 entries for the most recent edition of the Grove Encyclopedia of American Art. Dr. Raverty is a retired associate professor with the New Jersey City University, where he taught 19th and 20th century art history, the art of West Africa, the diaspora, and African American art, as well as the Renaissance and Baroque periods. He has taught abroad in Italy, both in Rome and in Florence. An award-winning teacher, Dr. Raverty lives in New York City and is currently working on a book project on American illustration with Dennis Dietrich, former president of the Society of Illustrators. And we're very happy to welcome back Dr. Dennis Raverty for his presentation today on the Gaudi masterpiece, the Sagrada Familia. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dennis Raverty.
Thank you for having me back. And it's a real treat to talk about the Sagrada Familia because it's really one of my favorite works of architecture. And we're going to be, as I was preparing for this lecture, I realized there's so much material that actually I could do a series of 5 lectures or maybe even a whole semester just on this one church. It's still not finished. The latest projection is 2028, but it's been over 150 years in the making now, and it's slowly becoming more and more finished. And Gaudi famously said, "My client isn't in a hurry." And what he meant was not the Catholic Church, but God, you know. So we're going to look at this, and actually sometimes it's called a cathedral, but it is not a cathedral. There is a cathedral at Barcelona, medieval Gothic cathedral in the center of the city, but this is kind of more outlying. And it's actually called an expiatory temple, the expiatory temple of the Holy Family, the Sagrada Familia. And what is the expiation for? Therefore, the sins of materialism and atheism. And he meant this to be a testament to faith that slowly would take shape. And the additions since his death is almost 100 years ago, 1926, there have been a number of additions, and each addition is controversial because the artist is no longer alive. But I actually think that Gaudi was an artist who was making it up as he went along. He would change his designs many times in the realization of them. So he didn't feel, bounded by that. Gaudi's work is part of a larger art movement and design movement known as, in this country mostly as Art Nouveau, which means new art. And here is a poster by Toulouse-Lautrec, French, but it really was an international movement. Here's the Belgian artist, an advertisement for beer. But what I want to emphasize here is that these plant forms, you can see the plant forms in the background, the plant forms in her hair, everything is kind of curving and plant-like and lifelike and organic. And even the lettering has that Art Nouveau kind of a thing. I wanted to point out, though, that in the 19th century, architecture was very conservative. And the 19th century was the only century, the 1800s, that didn't come up with its own style until the very end of the century with Art Nouveau. Before that, it was neo-Gothic, neo-classical, neo-Renaissance, neo-Baroque, mix them and match them, sometimes in horrifying combinations. The subway system in Paris was designed by Hector Grimont. And then you can see the plant-like forms there at the entrance to the Metropolitain. And in Belgium, we have Victor Horta, one of my favorite buildings, the Tassel House. And you can see these organic forms, these curving forms, dictate the silhouette of the building. It doesn't have a hard corner, for example, but a rounded corner, more like natural forms growing. And the interior carries through this completely, where everything are these tendrils. Look at, for example, at the top of these pillars, how it kind of explodes into these plant-like forms, or the mosaic on the floor. And you're just kind of surrounded by this environment of these plant forms and cascading stairways and things like that. So it's very, very much influenced by the natural world. There was also a German version of it. And in Germany, they call it Jugendstil. And Klimt is one of the artists from that period. However, what we're going to look at is the Spanish version. And the Spanish version is called Modernismo, which is kind of confusing. It sounds like just modernism, but it's not, because actually a lot of modern architecture in the middle of the century looked disparagingly on Art Nouveau as too decorative, especially with that Bauhaus kind of aesthetic of clean, machine-like functionality. This frivolous sort of ornamentation was seen as kind of an impure thing compared to German modernism, for example. Here's one of Gaudi's things, Antoni Gaudi. He's sometimes called Antonio Gaudi. However, Barcelona is the capital of the region of Catalonia, and they have their own language, Catalan. And so I've made an attempt to do everything, because very often people pronounce things with Spanish pronunciation instead of Catalan. And they're very self-conscious about their language being a separate thing. And when you're in Barcelona, all the signs are in Catalan and then Spanish, so that you see both of them. And part of this was Catalan was actually not allowed to be spoken during the period of fascism. Here's one of Gaudi's most elaborate and beautiful buildings, the Casa Batlló. And it's, as you can see, the whole front of it is just one plant-like form after another, cascading up the side of the thing. The forms are very organic. Look at those balconies. Look at the rounded windows, the stained glass windows. It's incredibly ornate and decorated. And it almost has, the way he handles the stone, it almost looks like it's growing forms. It's hard to realize that they're actually hard stone, because he's trying to create these kinds of forms. Here's the interior. And the Casa Batlló is no longer a real residence, and it's completely a museum now. So for like €5, you can walk around in it and see how these very rich Catalan patrons of his lived. And I believe this is about 1904, 1905. So it's early 20th century. And actually a lot of his, in fact, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Barcelona is Gaudi's city. That is, even the buildings that aren't by Gaudi kind of look like they could be by him. He rules the city in the same way that Brunelleschi kind of rules Florence. When you go to Florence, it's Brunelleschi's city. I mean, even when other architects are doing it, they're doing it in his style. So it has this wonderful kind of continuity. Yeah, it's very, look at that ceiling. Look at how it's like a shell form. So he's always looking at organic forms to try to create his things. And of course, he uses lots of different craftsmen. He doesn't do this by himself. He designs it and supervises it, like a great chef who supervises several cooks under him. He would, supervise the glass blowers and the stone carvers and the people who laid the parquet floor and so forth. It's a wonderful, exuberant, crazy kind of building. Even crazier is Park Güell. Güell was one of his patrons that believed very, very much in him. And luckily, he had patrons who believed in him. Because the difficult thing about architecture is you have to have a patron in order to build it. When you're a painter, you can paint in your attic. You can paint in the kitchen, But to have your things realized in real architecture, really, it takes money. And so here he designed a home for Güell, but he also did a park that if you go, you must go to this park. It is just crazy. And you can see a little bit of its craziness right here at this entry gate. And you can see the city of Barcelona beyond, and then the Mediterranean. He uses broken crockery, in other words, ceramic, dishes that he breaks up and then embeds in a wall like that for these decorative things. And this is kind of a railing that goes around. It is, look at this, it's a chameleon, right? And it's all with this broken crockery. It's made of concrete, and then he's put the broken crockery, but the broken crockery even rules the steps and everything. Everything is like this. It's incredible. He's really incredible. Okay, so the Sagrada Familia it was only his second commission in 1885. So he's born in 52, so I guess he was 31, something like that, early 30s. And this is a drawing made in 1910. He supervised it, but an assistant did it. And it shows kind of his vision of the eastern facade at this point. And it kept changing, but this is the point that we see. So we have some drawings that are like this. We unfortunately lost a lot of the drawings during the Spanish Civil War when it was destroyed. But they've been able to carry on with it nonetheless. This is how it looks today. It's not finished. That middle spire is going up. There was originally supposed to be 18 spires. This is the eastern facade that faces, the east, so it's brilliantly illuminated in the morning. He had situated it very carefully. And the other side, and this side has sculptures that relate to the birth of Jesus and the stories that lead up to his birth and the stories that come after his birth up to the age of 12. And we'll look at these sculptures in great detail in this lecture. But the other facade on the west side is much more sorrowful, and it's the Passion facade. And it's about the death and betrayal and crucifixion of Christ. And that's on the west side, so it comes in the afternoon. And there are red stained glass windows, so it does this red thing in the late afternoon, and a kind of a blue thing in the morning, because the windows on the east side are blue predominantly. This is the front, and so it's a long basilica that's cross-shaped. The front portal has not yet been started on even. It was commissioned by a devotional society of Saint Joseph, who in Spanish is San Jose, but in Catalan is Josep. And in fact, many art historians mispronounce Catalan names, like Joan Miró. I was taught Juan Miró, and when I was in Spain, someone said, that's incorrect. It's Joan. It's not Spanish. We don't speak Spanish. Well, they do speak Spanish, but actually, they're very proud of their heritage. Here is St. Joseph with the infant Christ as part of this portal, and I just want to talk a little bit about St. Joseph because he was the one who was the inspiration for the whole thing, this devotional society devoted to St. Joseph. I want to just point out that, see those little spiky things that are coming up? You might wonder what that is. They put that there so that the pigeons don't land there, because the pigeons land and then they poop all over the statue, and so there's a lot of things, you'll see that in the background. But I want to mention just a little bit here how robustly it's sculpted. It doesn't have lots of fine, delicate sort of folds, but heavy kind of broadly sketched in or broadly rendered masses. And that's because you're looking up at it. So he has to have a robustness to it so that you can see it up there. And what I think we'll be able to do in this lecture is we'll be able to see a lot of the sculptures up close that you couldn't see if you were there, right? Which doesn't mean you get off without going to Barcelona. You have to put it on your bucket list. It really is a beautiful city. The basilica form is a cross form, right? And where the heart is, that's where the crossing is. It also, of course, relates to the human figure. And so this is a medieval drawing, right, of the proportions of a church as if you're on top of it looking down, kind of a domed structure. These are the plans that he drew up for Sagrada Familia. And the three facades correspond to the three, I don't know what they're called, three devotional prayer cycles of the rosary. Rosary are those beads that they pray with. And there are joyful mysteries about Jesus' birth. There are the sorrowful mysteries about his death, and then the glorious mysteries about his resurrection and ascension. on it. So we have all of these here: is the east facade, the west facade, the unfinished front, and this giant nave in the center. And nave comes from the same word as boat or ship. So it's conceived of that the church is like an ark, like Noah's Ark, right? And we're kind of going through this era of materialism and collectivization and all that sort of stuff, and atheism. And this is an expiation for that. Okay, I want to look a little bit at the surroundings, because these really weird rock forms surround Barcelona, and this is Montserrat. Very kind of distinctive things. You can see where he gets some of his visual ideas from these mountains. There's a monastery up there that you can visit, and here it is with the Abbey Church and so forth, and a lot of visitors come there. But one of the interesting things is underneath Montserrat is a underground stream. So that, and it's very dark, and you can't go in there, but I mean, there is a stream, and they knew about it there. And so Gaudi uses this idea of the stream in his sculpture. Okay, so here's one of the most famous peaks of Montserrat, you know, the way it goes up. And this is his kind of imitation of it. And let me get my arrow. Can the arrow show up? Yeah, you can see it's kind of like this, but down here is St. Joseph in a boat. And I'll give you a close-up of that. And he's kind of going through a tunnel, so it represents Montserrat. And here's Joseph in the boat. He's steering the boat. In the front is a light, and they're going into the darkness, right? So this journey, this on the nave, on the ark, is going through the darkness and bringing light into the darkness. That's why this theme is perfect for today, because this tonight will be the very longest night of the year. We're on the solstice. So that this, and all these themes that we get in Christmas, but we also get in Hanukkah, and we also get in pagan religions even, when the sun gets very, very dark and the nights are long, this idea of light in the midst of the darkness. And I'm sorry, this is not a very good picture, but it's the only picture I could get of the lantern, because behind the lantern, it's not visible in this, but behind the lantern is a tent that represents the Ark of the Covenant. That is, when the Hebrews got the 10 Commandments written by God, they carried it around for 40 years in a tent that served as the temple while they were on the move. And then when they settled in Israel, then they built the temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. So it's kind of saying that that Joseph is the caretaker of the law, of the Jewish law, and takes the Jewish law and brings it in to the darkness of the cavern with this light, lit by the Torah, right? Okay. So here is Joseph, and here's the lamp, and also an anchor, because anchor, makes you study. When you reach the light, you can anchor yourself in. And Joseph is kind of both the shipman, the ship's captain, but he's also the person who's going to put on the anchor at the end of the journey when we come to the light at the end of the tunnel. See how perfect this is for our season. And I thought I'd throw in a little bit of this poem by St. John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz, 16th century Catholic mystic. Talks about luminosity and the symbolism of fire in this poem called Living Flame of Love. And this is just a segment of it, but lamps of human fire and deepest transparency, the lowly caverns of the senses, once shadowy and blind, now flare in light and warmth and wake the lover with amazing joy. And who is the lover? The lover is the image of God within. Okay, so that's what this is talking about. So we have to have some Catholic ideas here to be able to navigate ourselves through seeing these stories and these things. And we need to become familiar with a few Catholic concepts or Christian concepts so that we can navigate it better. It's kind of like when we're going to be looking at Caspar David Friedrich, the Romantic German, in January in a few weeks, we're going to have to examine the idea of the sublime, because it was the realization of the sublime that the Romantics were going for. You don't have to believe in the sublime, but you have to know that they believed that in order to really get it. So the same thing with this. You don't need to necessarily be a Christian or a convert or anything like that, but you kind of have to understand the ideas behind it so that the art makes sense to you. So incarnation is the central idea in Christianity, and that is that God can become incarnate in a human form. And for Christians, this is Jesus, right? But there's another level of it, that in a way, each of us are an incarnation, or at least there's a spark of divinity inside. And that spark can go out, and we can become, a fascist or whatever. Or we can take that spark, and if we do our kindling and we shepherd it very well, it can turn into a roaring flame that can give light and warmth. So that's the idea of incarnation. Not so much something that happened 2,000 years ago, but something that can happen now, right? Okay, so that's kind of the basic idea behind Christianity. And then a related idea that's more down to earth and closer to art is the idea of a sacrament, or what the Greek Orthodox call the mysteries. They just call them the mysteries, sacrament. A sacrament is let's see if I remember this from my catechism, a visible and outward sign of an invisible inward grace. So it has an outward form and a spiritual form, and they're together like that. So some of the sacraments, for example, marriage is a sacrament, and the form is the ring. The ring is the sacramental manifestation of this unity between two people. The sacrament of baptism, the symbol is water, right? In the sacrament of the Eucharist, it's the bread and wine, and so forth, right? But all art, in a way, could be thought of as sacramentally. That is, we're using something like stone or paint or broken crockery to kind of incarnate the presence of God if we do it well. So that's the idea, is that art is kind of a sacramental. It's a in between us and God is this doorway. That's a sacrament. And I think that Gaudi sees the whole project of the Sagrada Familia sacramentally. That what he's doing, he's assisting. He's like a priest at Mass, not doing magic, but participating in this revelation. Okay, so that's where we're going. Okay, so this is the Nativity facade. We're going to mostly look at the Nativity facade because partly of the time of the year, but also because it's not time to do everything. But what I want to point out here, and here's the central door, it is encrusted with these platforms. They're just all over. They're kind of like stalactites and stalagmites in a thing. And it does make it difficult to read. And so I think what we're going to do here is we're going to go very slowly through scene by scene in this magnificent facade and tell the stories. I'm going to concentrate on telling the stories because a lot of people aren't familiar with these stories. And so we want to be able to do it that way. When I was in graduate school at one time, I did a lot of Jewish elder hostels during the summer. And I got invited by one of them to Sarasota, Florida, to do the Italian Renaissance for non-Christians, which was a really interesting assignment because I had to think of how can I do this in a way, because these people didn't know the stories. When you raise a Christian, you kind of think everybody knows these stories. So I'm going to concentrate on the story aspect of it rather than on style or other objects. Now, the stories come from basically three sources. The Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament, and this is often considered the most Jewish of the four Gospels because it has a lot of references back to the Tanakh or to the Hebrew Bible. But, you see, in our story, we kind of blend them all together. So I want to separate them out. Gospel of Matthew, the angel does not appear to Mary. Jesus is not born in a stable. They don't mention anything like that. The angel comes instead to Joseph, right, in a dream. And so Joseph is the one who receives the messages. And we don't know, we're not told much about what Mary thinks. The Gospel of Luke is the opposite. That tells everything kind of from Mary's standpoint. And so the born in a stable, because there's no room for them in the inn. That story, the story of the shepherds, those are from the Gospel of Luke. So we kind of blend them together. Because you often see these creche scenes where there's shepherds and wise men and they're all there at the stable. But that's not really how the stories originally are if you separate them out. There's also a much less well-known piece called the Proto-Evangelicum, or the Proto-Gospel of James. And this, most scholars think, is 2nd or maybe even 3rd century, quite a bit later than these two earlier biblical ones that are from about 80 or 90 AD. Pro-Gospel of James, 150 to 200 to 250. And this tells the story of Mary's early life. The church has known a lot about it for a long time, but they don't put it in the Bible because there are different Gnostic things in it and so forth, I guess, that mess it up. But it's kind of interesting because it shows Mary, for example, is raised near the temple, and she's in the court of the women as a Nazarite, as a person who gives up alcohol and fasts as Nazarite. So she was a female Nazarite as a child. And it's said in the Proto-Gospel of James that she and these other girls wove the garments and the vestments for the priests in the temple. Now you might think, priest? Well, Jews had priests during the day of the temple because they had a ritual function of sacrificing animals and so forth. So there was a whole dimension of priesthood that was there. And there were rabbis too. Rabbis were teachers and they were in synagogues, but it was the priest that was at the temple. Now this first one shows the betrothal of Joseph with the, I guess, a priest, a Jewish priest, his concept of a Jewish priest. It looks very Sephardic, doesn't it, that kind of hat. I went to a Sephardic Jewish Shabbat when I was teaching in Rome. And it was very different than the kind of Ashkenazic rituals that we're used to. And the cantor had this thing that looked kind of like this. So this is the betrothal of Mary and Joseph. It's not their marriage, it's their betrothal. Because, and the story goes that Mary was, as she came closer to the years of puberty, if she started menstruating, that would make her ritually impure to stay in the women's court of the temple. So they wanted to have her marry. And there's a story that all these men were there wanting to be her husband, and she's a 14-year-old girl. And the high priest asked for a sign, and bam, the staff of an elderly widower burst into roses. Right, so that he was the one who was the caretaker of the virgin. So we have this thing between this very old man and this very young woman. And you can see the roses there. Also, the roses talk about the rosary, the beads. They're reference to both of those things. So that's Joseph. You notice that the nose is broken off. There are some things like that that do need to be repaired when the thing is this old. Now, they were betrothed, but while they were still engaged, an angel, Gabriel, appears to Mary, says, "Hail Mary, full of grace," and asks her permission to be the mother of God's Son. And she says, "Be it according to your word." So she bows down like that with her head covered, and the angel Gabriel kind of has his hand like power is passing through his hand from God above. And you see God in the rondelle up there? That's God the Father sitting on his throne. And he's the one who's giving the message, and he's the one that's dispensing grace. And you can see the rosary beads. See them all around? Little chains, rosary beads, medallions, and so forth. Below it is a rooster crowing, right? Because this is when chickens lay an egg, I had an uncle who was a chicken farmer. When chickens lay eggs, they make a lot of noise. Buck, buck, buck. They run around and they do that. So this is kind of like that. And he uses animals very beautifully in this kind of thing. Now, Mary then visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is an old lady, but she's pregnant. She's like 65 and she's pregnant. It's a miraculous pregnancy. And her cousin Elizabeth is going to be the mother of John the Baptist, John the Baptizer. So Mary goes to visit her and she says that the child leapt in her womb at the voice of Mary, right? So she comes, she said, "Me too, I'm pregnant too." The unfortunate thing from Mary's standpoint, I suppose, is though the angel talked to her, they didn't talk to any other girls in the town. And so you can imagine the kind of gossip that went around when this young woman suddenly becomes pregnant. And she said, angel be, yeah, I bet he was an angel. You know, I can just hear the responses to that. So Joseph gets word of this. He knows he's not the father. So he decides to divorce her privately, or, not in an ostentatious way. And I actually called up Rabbi Jeff, who I use as a resource on Jewish stuff. And he told me that actually you do need a divorce from a promise of marriage. That's why it's the betrothal instead of the marriage, because the promise to marriage is a contract in Jewish law, and you'd have to break the contract. And the woman getting pregnant definitely is grounds for breaking that contract. So Joseph decides he's just going to divorce her and maybe marry someone else, or just live as a widower or whatever. But then an angel comes to him in the dream. And he says, do not reject Mary. The child is from God. And so Joseph does the manly thing, and he doesn't ask any questions, and he raises the son as if it were his own son. But he also has this other son from the earlier marriage, and that's James. I forgot to tell you that. That's who's purported to write this, is this brother of Jesus, who's mentioned in the book of Acts, by the way. Paul and James have some disagreements. Okay, so here's the nativity itself. It's right over the front door, the central door, because it's the nativity facade. So there Mary and Joseph are, I guess, in the stable, and I guess this is the feeding trough that Jesus is in, laid in there because there was no room for the inn. They came because of a Roman census, but there was no, everyone wanted a room that night, and so she ends up giving birth in a barn, in a stable. And you can see the animals there with her, the ass and the ox. There's Jesus. He has a very, he's engaged. He looks directly at us. He seems kind of wise beyond his years. You can't actually see this when you're there because it's kind of up. So we get some interesting, by the way, this is limestone. You notice it has a very kind of a rough texture because that's way, it's not marble. Here's the I guess a mule instead of a donkey on the side, and then the ox. So he's born in a barn with the animals. And this is interesting because you'd think he'd be born the king's son or a rich man's son or something, but he's not. And that's kind of the irony of the story. The shepherds, there were shepherds that were abiding in the fields nearby Bethlehem, watching their sheep by night so that the wolves don't come and steal the lambs. And angels appear to them and sing and dance in the sky and say, go to Bethlehem to see the king of the Jews. And so they take their things and they go into town and they find him there. And the angel said, you'll find him in a stable, in a manger. And so this is them. I had some wonderful close-ups of this, this enraptured face of this shepherd boy. And the little dog and the little lamb even. It's just wonderful. Just without ever getting sentimental or corny. It's not, precious moments or anything like that. But it brings you to that, it's a wonderfully charming thing. This is an interior shot of his studio, and I'm sorry it's so, it's such an unclear thing, but what he did is he got models, and he, paid models and worked for models, but he also made casts of models. So he'd have models do different things, cast them in plaster, and that's what some of these are here. We see these plaster babies, we see plaster figures, they're all cast from life. And then he uses that as the prototype that the stonemasons do their sculpture from. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So this is the, let me see what my time is. Okay. And the angels are shown as well, playing musical instruments. Here, one playing a violin, another playing a lute, right? And both of these instruments, by the way, come from the Arabs. And a lot of my students didn't realize Spain was an Islamic country until the Middle Ages. And it wasn't until 1492 that it became re-Christianized. So there's a real element of Islamic, and there's a real element of Islamic decoration in his work, because Islamic art is just full of things. It doesn't have, it's a horror vacui, it doesn't have any empty spaces. And so he's influenced by that decorative thing coming out of the Islamic kind of heritage of Spain. Here's a bassoonist angel. And notice all the flowers and the plants. It's just like the plants are growing right directly out of the stone, between the things. Angel playing a harp, playing a shawm, another Arabic instrument. And then if we return to Matthew's gospel, it's in Matthew's gospel only that they talk about the three wise men, or the magi, coming from the east. We think that they would have been Zoroastrians, perhaps, from Iran, because the Zoroastrian religion used stars and astrology as part of their discerning of God's will, and God is called Ahura Mazda. So this is kind of an interfaith thing going on, right? Because these guys aren't Jews, right? But yet they're coming, and they represent the Gentiles picking up on Judaism. It's a universalization of the Jewish law into, and so that's what they kind of represent. Okay, so here they are, the three wise men. And before they come to Bethlehem, where Mary and Joseph seem to live, in Matthew's gospel, they first go to Jerusalem. And they go to King Herod, the evil King Herod, right? And they say that they've come, they want to know where the Messiah will be born. So he asks his holy men and his, rabbi counselors, and they say that it's going to be Bethlehem. So he points them toward Bethlehem and says, please go take your gifts to this new king, and then come back and tell me, so that I may go and worship him as well. He did not mean it. What he wanted to do is to murder the child. So he was, bring the child to me, a kind of a very evil thing. Herod, by the way, was a puppet governor. I mean, he was just under the thumb of the Roman governor. And he's called Herod the Great, not because he was so great, but the great thing he did is he rebuilt the temple. So the temple that was there until the Romans destroyed it is King Herod's temple. Anyway, so they go and they bring their gifts. And the gifts are very symbolic, And where's the line between, symbol and sacrament and reality and history and myth? It gets very hard to distinguish in many ways. But the three gifts were symbolic gifts. One is gold, and he holds it in a little tiny chest like that. And gold, because of its shimmering quality and because of the rarity of this metal, it's treasured. But it's in a very simple box. And this is supposed to be the ideal of the good person. Simple, plain on the outside, but when you open it, filled with light and precious. Glittering, right? So it's that metaphor. The second magi brings frankincense, incense, and that's an incense burner there. And you put a piece of incense on a charcoal and light it up, and a chemical change takes place that makes it into smoke, right? And then it's used. You can see Catholics using it in blessing people like that. I used to be an altar boy when I was a kid, so I know how to do that thing without burning down the church. And so what that represents is the transformation that's supposed to take place within the human soul. Just like the rosin or whatever it is, heated by fire, has a chemical change that makes it fragrant and makes the smoke rise. So this is all a metaphor for the change that's necessitated, a change from the materialism and the atheism and so forth that he sees as kind of symptoms of the modern world out of touch with God. And the third jar is myrrh, and myrrh is an oil that you anoint the dead with. So it is a presentiment of his early death as well. But it has more of a meaning than that. it also indicates our own end, because we will all die. Will we be able to show forth that gold? Will our transformation, our divination, our theosis, represented by the frankincense, will that rise? Will we make that change before death? Right? Because death gives that finality to it. So we realize that there is limited time. All right? So it's a very kind of important symbolic meaning of these figures. Well, Herod, once the angel appears in the dream to the wise men and say, don't go back to Herod. Take another route home. So they go a long way. And when Herod realizes they betrayed him, he's furious. And he orders that all children, all male children under the age of 3 should be killed. Then he sends his guards out to slaughter the innocent children. And this is the sculpture that represents that. A Roman soldier holding up a baby, about to impale him, the mother begging at his side to restrain his hand. There's the baby up there. His foot is broken off the side. So there's some restoration things that need to be done on this. And then the dead baby, under his feet. It's incredible. And below are pelicans, and pelicans are another symbol of Christ. So, why doesn't Jesus die during that slaughter? Because the angel appears to Joseph in a dream in the book of Matthew, of course. And Joseph, he said, get up and take your wife and child and flee. And he gets up in the middle of the night and he flees to Egypt. It's the flight into Egypt. And so they avoid the murder that happens. So here we have Mary and Joseph. Mary's holding the infant Jesus and the donkey. And then the angel is this beautiful, young, athletic man leading the way. Yeah. Also, there's a story about the donkey. Is that when he was going to do the donkey, his assistants went out and tried to find the most beautiful donkey they could find. And they brought him this beautiful donkey. He said, that will never do. And he went out and he found a real homely donkey who had kind of a crooked mouth and a funny looking head. And he used that as the donkey. Because, you see, he was always on the side of the poor, always on the side of the rejects and the ugly and the marginalized. And so this comes to be a symbol of all this for him. Isn't this wonderful stuff? I love it. This is St. Joseph with the baby Jesus we looked at first. And this is young Jesus in the carpentry shop, right, as he's learning his father's trade, which is what people did in those times. And then there's a story, the only story really about the childhood of Jesus, and this is from Luke. And this is, the family goes to Jerusalem for Passover. And there's a very big extended family. And so there's a whole bunch of people returning to Nazareth, which is in the Galilee, in the north. And Mary and Joseph figure that Jesus is in with the cousins and stuff like that. And then they get, several hours out of Jerusalem, and they went, where is Jesus? He doesn't seem to, I thought he was with John. And they panic. And they go back to the temple, and they find Jesus is in there talking to the rabbis, asking them questions. And Mary says, your father and I were very worried about you. You shouldn't have done this. And he said, Mother, you must know, I must be about my Father's work. And he didn't mean carpentry, you see. He meant his heavenly Father's work. So that's an interesting thing out of it. So here they are searching. They're distraught that Jesus has been left. Oh, why did that? Sorry about that. So here, and in the center we have the young 12-year-old Jesus preaching. Now, in the gospel, they say he was asking the rabbis questions and he was making some interesting observations. But here, he's like preaching to them, right? So, and here's a good kind of close-up of it. In a kind of a royal chair, surrounded by 2 of his relatives. On the right, his cousin Zachariah, who is the father of John the Baptist. And an angel appears to him originally before Elizabeth is born and said that your wife will give birth to a prophet. And he said, it cannot be. My wife is 60-something. And so he's struck dumb by God for doubting the angel's word. And so they go through and they get the child, and they come to the point where they're going to name the child. And they want to know what his name is. And they're going to call him by another relative. You know, the tradition is to name your child after someone who's dead in your family. And then the child in the Judaism, and you kind of learn about that person as a way of connecting back to the past. But there was no John in the history of it. And so they go to Zechariah, who can't speak, and they're saying, what is the boy's name? And he writes out on a piece of paper, his name is John. And so here we have Joannes in Catalan. And it's interesting that he wears this breastplate, which was the breastplate of the high priest, and had 12 jewels in it that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's interesting that he got, because Zechariah was a priest, was a Jewish priest, and the priest would take turns at serving at the temple. And so what was my point? So everyone expected John, because priesthood was handed from father to son. And so everyone expected John the Baptist to be a priest, but instead he becomes a Nazarite. He becomes a crazy man who lives in the wilderness and eats locusts and abstains from meat and drink and doesn't have sex and all that sort of stuff. And he preaches to repent. John himself is shown on the other side of this thing. You can see him there in close up. And here John is kind of acting deferential toward Christ, because he says, I forget which gospel it is, but he said, I baptize you with water, but one is coming after me who will baptize you with fire, right? So his fiery sermon is part of this, and his demeanor of that. Let's see what we're doing on time, because it would be very easy to go on forever. Okay, so I have to speed up. There are interesting gargoyles that are like, this is a salamander, I believe. Here's another snake, right? So the gargoyles are actual animals. Here's a really interesting one, and this is a demon. It has like a lizard's body, but it has a man's face. It's hard to read. You see the man's face, the nose, the mouth? So it's a lizard, and he's handing an anarchist a bomb. Right? He's handing an anarchist a bomb. Because there were a lot of anarchists and communists there and he wanted to show that the atheism of communism, the atheism of anarchism is wrong and is inspired by demons. So it's very interesting that he does these gargoyles, and this one is like this. Here's another one of Mary, and this is very hard to get a picture of, but she also, in this one, steps on a snake. There's a lamp underneath, and that represents God's light. And she's standing on the world, and she's crushing a snake. So she's kind of considered the new Eve. Whereas Eve was beguiled by the snake, Mary triumphs over the snake. She doesn't kill it, right, but she steps on it so that it's brought under her heel. So that, in other words, devil is not gone, evil is not gone, but it can be suppressed, right, by powerful human will buttressed by God's grace. So she looks up to heaven and crushes the serpent underneath her. And these are very hard to see because it's like in a grotto almost there, this little peak. But I want you to notice that if you go up one register, we have this interesting symbol, the Hamza, which is another Jewish symbol, and it's I always thought from East Europe, but it's an eye in a hand, and it's a symbol that wards off the evil eye. It's what it's supposed to be. So it's interesting they put this little Jewish symbol in there. It's kind of like a gargoyle, I suppose, in some ways. Finally, at the apex of this thing, Mary is crowned Queen of the Angels and Saints. And you look up and you see Jesus has a crown, and she kneels before him, and he crowns her Queen of Heaven. Because the Catholics believe, and this isn't in the Bible, but the Catholics believe that Mary, like Jesus, also went into heaven after the third day of being in the grave. So bodily was assumed into heaven. It's interesting that Jesus ascends into heaven, but Mary is assumed into heaven. It's interesting distinction between male and female. Also, there are other, Joseph is shown on the side with his staff, that same staff that burst into flowers. And on the other side is John the Baptist, showing his, again, the whole family there. Mother, son, cousin, in this Holy Family, Sagrada Familia. Angels at the very top of it, almost, trumpet the Last Judgment, these amazing figures. And then at the very, very top of this thing is a cypress tree with doves and a tau cross at the top. And cypress trees in Europe are used in graveyards. This is the Isle of the Dead by Arnold Böcklin, who's a Swiss artist from around the same time. But you can see here Isle of the Dead, the boatman is ferrying the deceased to this Isle of the Dead, and so cypress trees. But also, more famously, the cypress tree in Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, which I don't know if Gaudi was familiar with, but he might have been by the end of his life. But here, this cypress trees raise up like a black flame in the left side of the picture. And of course, this is the same summer, only a few months later, he kills himself, Van Gogh. So it's an ominous sign. But here it's not ominous. It's still a reference to death, but death is joyful, right? Death is joyful because it's just the end to a life filled with grace. So that doves appear, and at the very top is a tau cross or a T-shaped cross, which is the kind of cross that symbolizes the Franciscans, the followers of St. Francis, who are barefoot and who they embrace poverty. And so their symbol is a cross that's that way, but also that X relates to the Latin word pax, peace, right, with that P-A-X. So that X, sometimes you see that P with an X. Have you ever seen that? It means peace. It means pax. It's the symbol of pax. And of course, everything has those broken crockery on it. He uses it like mosaic tiles. It's wonderful. When he was in his 70s, see, Gaudi, I didn't bring pictures of him because there are very few pictures of him. He was very shy. He wasn't an outgoing person. When he was young, he was a dandy with a walking stick and everything like that. But when he became old, he really wanted to be kind of anonymous. And I guess he dressed shabbily, and he didn't trim his beard as often as he should or whatever. So he kind of looked like a homeless person wandering around. And he was hit by a trolley car and got caught in it, was dragged for like a block. And the people thought he was like a homeless person, and they didn't realize, he died a few days later, that he was the great Gaudi who, had designed their whole city. Because he was such a unassuming kind of character. This is how it looked. I don't know how to make that stop, but this is how it looked in 1926 when Gaudi died. And it was only the Nativity facade was the only one that was finished by that time. And here is another shot of the church. So it's just that one facade and then the apse where the thing is. And many scholars, I'm not included with this, but many of them, and I knew a guy who was on a Fulbright. He was from Barcelona. He said the construction should have stopped at that point because they went on and they finished the whole thing. But one of the problems is the Spanish Civil War intervened there. In 1936, 10 years after his death, the Spanish a Republican government, a Democratic government was elected, and they wanted to redistribute land redistribution. And so they were voted into power, and they began their program, and then fascists under Generalissimo Franco declared war on the elected government. So the elected government was besieged and finally took refuge in Barcelona as the rest of the country fell into the hand of fascism. And this went on for a couple years before they were defeated. So the bad guys won. The fascists won. We know that fascism was defeated in Germany. It was defeated in Italy. But in Spain, the fascists stayed in dictatorial power till 1970s, I think 77. here are some scenes from the Civil War. It was an international cause because it seems it was kind of democracy against fascism. Here's a famous picture of a young female revolutionary, because one of the things the revolution advocated was, I wish I could make it stop that, but I don't know how to do it. Yeah, it's a great photo. Yeah, they believe in the equality of women. They had a lot of idealistic ideas, but Franco would have none of it. So in 1937, in collaboration with the Nazis, Nazi bombers carpet bombed the little farming village of Guernica. It had no military, it wasn't a military site. There wasn't any armaments there, wasn't anything. It was just an act of terror. It was like, do not oppose the fascist or this will happen to you. And Picasso, living in Paris, but he was named the director of the Prado at that time, but he was in exile. He did this huge painting called Guernica, where it shows the bomb exploding in the barn, probably the most famous and most celebrated anti-war, anti-fascist painting. It's a huge painting. And I first saw it in the Museum of Modern Art because Picasso loaned it to the museum, and he said it will not return to Spain till fascism is over. And when fascism was over, it went back, and there it is in the Reina Sofia Museum today. There was a lot of death and a lot of atrocities on both sides of this. The fascists, of course, if you oppose them, they just kill you. They use terror and murder as a way of getting their way. However, they were also, the beleaguered centrist liberal government was also beleaguered by a far left of communists and anarchists who wanted immediate revolution. They didn't want to go through the parliamentary procedure of being voted in and so forth. So they had, and they did a lot of atrocities against the Catholic Church. They burned down a nunnery. None of the nuns were in it, but they did that as a sign of terror, like don't, you know. So there was the Catholics and the fascists were on one side, and the communists and the anarchists and the democratic people were on the other side. And it became a cause, an international cause célèbre, so that a lot of American and people from all over would come to fight on the side of the democracy, but it failed nonetheless. I'm just going to go very quickly through the rest of this because we're not going to spend a lot of time, but I want to look at Josep Maria Subirach, who in the late 70s and 1980s was given the commission of doing the Passion facade. The problem with completing it is communists and anarchists, fed up with fascism, fed up with the church's collaboration with fascism, broke into his studio and burned all the drawings and all the models. And so there was only one drawing left of this facade. And he didn't do this facade first because he felt that it was more radical and it would not go over as well, that the Nativity facade was more traditional in a way and would probably go over better. And so he wanted to let people see that before they raised money for the other thing. So this man, who was born the year after Gaudi died, was given this commission. And I think he did a good job of it. It's very kind of bony and very different looking than the vegetal kind of heavily encrusted other facade. But just a few things from it. It uses a kind of geometric structure and these are the soldiers. Jesus is arrested. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, is on the right. Veronica holds the face of, she herself is faceless. This is an interesting thing. Veronica, veros means true, iconos means image. So Veronica, it's said, was a disciple of Jesus, and on his way to Calvary with the cross, she wiped his face with her towel or with a veil or something, and had this miraculous image from it. And I think what's interesting here is the miraculous image is in negative. It's kind of so that it's one of those things where the eyes follow you around. But also the blank expression on Veronica's face kind of suggests that Jesus is taking her face, or that Jesus is becoming her new face. She's lost to her old self, and now she becomes part of this incarnational, sacramental thing that's going on, right? Okay, so that's the faceless kind of person whose face is, and then Jesus, and he's crucified on I-beams, right? Steel I-beams, the type that you use in construction. And then on the base is a skull of Adam, because according to some legends, the very spot where Jesus was crucified was the place that Adam was buried. It's very powerful and expressive, but a lot of people did not like it. The interior they continued to work on, and it opened in 2014. So 20 years ago, they had the first Mass there with Pope Benedict. And the interior is incredible. You have to wait in line a long time. But once you get into that interior, it is one of the most amazing architectural spaces I've ever been in. The spirituality was just palpable. It's such a beautiful, gorgeous space. Again, for the pillars, he uses trees that's with branches that go up and kind of flower out in that way. He didn't like flying buttresses that are used in Gothic cathedrals, so he wanted to do all the supports from the interior. Now this is facing the western facade. In the afternoon, you can see it's dominated by reds and yellows, and that tragic Passion side. I guess both of these are from that side. On the eastern side, they're predominantly blue windows. So in the morning, you get all this blue kind of Mary light, and in the afternoon, you get this red blood thing, right? Incredible stuff. And here is a priest, because they're using it to celebrate Mass now. You can go over there and go to Mass if you'd like to. I want to close with another poem by St. John of the Cross. And it's a very, very short poem. It's the entire poem, but it's called The Divine Word. Pregnant with the divine word will come the Virgin, wandering down the road, if you will take her in. Thank you. This is my website. If you'd like to go and see my website, let me just see if I can get that up here, DennisRaverty.com, and you can see new topics, upcoming events, right, like the Sagrada Familia. Also, I have some publications. This is coming up, this Winter's Journey here, and you can go, and a lot of them are in Long Island, and I do a lot of them. So, retirement is great. I'm keeping myself very, very busy. I'm not just sitting around watching I Love Lucy reruns. But it's amazing because my nephew said, my last birthday, I won't tell you which it was, but he said, is there a decade that you see as the decade of my 60s was really my best. My 30s were better than my 20s. My 40s were better than my 30s. It just keeps getting better. So this is the time. This is the best time. And the great thing about this, look at what a great audience we get here, even in the middle of a snowstorm. This is amazing. My students, snowstorm, not going to school that day, And there's no papers to grade. I don't have to worry about plagiarism, So it's just the fun parts, Okay, so let's open up for questions.
Sure. Well, and thank you so much, Dennis. This has been terrific. And for those on Zoom, you can type any questions you may have in the chat. And I see a hand over here. Just come right over to you.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. I had some questions about Gaudi, though.
Uh-huh.
I was first there in 1962.
Yep.
And the tour I was on did stress that his whole idea was this was not going to be a church, and it was just like an ode to God. And as you said, against materialism, to bring people back to a more innocent and truthful time. Mm-hmm. Yet over the years, when I was there again 30 years later, the tour did seem to suggest that this was becoming more of a Christian church than Gaudi had thought about. And I wondered how that happened over the years and where the money came from to continue the work and how that's changed from his original vision.
Yeah, good question. He continued to work on it and revise himself all the time. And I think that's one of the reasons that people give for adding to it even afterwards. Can you give me your question again, just very briefly? So I'm having a senior moment here.
I think it was that, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, how the money, yes.
To continue it and why it has become more of a Christian church than he envisioned.
I don't agree that it's more of a Christian church than he envisioned. I think from the very start, he saw it as a Christian church. And I think one of the reasons he called it a temple was to distinguish it from the Cathedral of Barcelona. Because the bishop was very upset that this would take away from the cathedral, which was from the Middle Ages and was the seat of the bishop, and he didn't. So I think when called an expiatory temple, it was a way of saying this is not in competition with the cathedral. This is its own thing. But this expiation was really part of it. But he always intended there to be masses and for there to be worship and Catholic worship. So he was very much immersed in Catholicism. But you can see how much of, for example, Jewish mysticism arises here, Jewish ideas. I mean, he knows his stuff. But I never heard that he wanted to be not a Christian place. Only thing I know, he calls it a temple because he wants to distinguish it so that it won't interfere with the Catholics there. A lot of it was from that Society of St. Joseph, the Brotherhood of St. Joseph, and there was a devotional society that met to do the rosaries, and they had speakers, and it was like a club. And they raised the money to do it. But they had to keep raising money because it was an ongoing project, and it took up more money than originally was projected. And that's why it kind of went through all these different things. The way he raised money for these things, part of it came from the Catholic Church, part of it came from donations from. One of his biggest sponsors was Güell. What's that? Oh, someone's phone. Is that me? No, okay. I was wondering if the angel was going to appear for a minute there. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't have a question. I was just there in October.
Oh.
Saw this, and the tour guide that I had said he was a very devoted Catholic.
Yeah.
In everything, the rosaries are in
Yeah.
different things.
Yeah.
But he also, if you go in there, every single religion has a huge picture, sayings, all on the sides.
Yeah.
So it seemed to me it was Catholic, but it was about holy.
Yeah, it has a universal kind of attitude toward it. And this, he also does, for example, the signs of the zodiac over one of the doors, which you wouldn't think, So he does mix different things together. But he does that in style, too, where he'll mix the Baroque thing with a Gothic thing and puts it all together. And a lot of modernists didn't like this at all. I mean, the kind of the German functionalism. And I love that stuff, too, like the Bauhaus. But, there's that book written 1903 or something by Adolf Loos. The German, he was an Austrian, but he was called Crime and Ornament because his ornament is related to crime. And he said that all these ex-cons and murderers have tattoos all over them, and that's a sign of the decadence of the whole thing. So he thought that for things to be pure, to be simple, to be functional, easy to clean, that kind of modern look, he felt it also had these moral aspects to it. And they thought this was mixed up and jumbled and not clean and functional the way they would want it to be. And one of the strangest things in Barcelona, and I don't know if you went there when you were there, but is Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion, which he built in 1928 for a international, and he was the head of the Bauhaus in Germany, and it's this very modern building in the middle of all this Gaudi stuff. It's really kind of a strange thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, I want to say that you clarify something for me, which I always misunderstood, which is that James was not Jesus' actual brother. It was his stepbrother. Right?
Well,
So
yeah.
Mary was, I always said, well, Mary was a virgin when she gave birth, but then she had another child, James.
Yeah, this is how the Protestants think of it, because the Protestants, well, because James is mentioned in the Bible. It's not just this book, and he definitely did not write that book. It's later on. It was attributed to him. But what was my point here?
No, I was saying that James is said
James,
to be his brother. And that was my
Protestants believe that Jesus was the firstborn son of Mary, but then she had other sons the regular way. But the Catholics have this idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary, that she was a virgin from the day go all the way through to the end. So I think maybe making Joseph into an elderly person made it seem less likely that there's going to be a sexual relationship, that it was going to be more of a protector kind of a thing. So in the book of James, he claims to say that he is the son of Joseph from an earlier marriage, So that's how they explain it, But it's, by that time, I think the idea of the perpetual virginity is around, and whoever the author is kind of trying to substantiate that way, by calling it, by saying, oh, he wasn't really the brother.
Yeah.
It was, but in the book of Acts, it says the brother of the Lord. They don't say the half-brother or anything like that. So and to complicate it even more, the Greek word for brother and cousin is the same. So the Orthodox say he was really cousin, so it's.
So the Orthodox, that's the Greek Orthodox, they have a different, I know there's one of the things that separated the Greek Orthodox from the Roman Catholics was
it's
this whole thing about Mary and how she should be viewed and venerated, right?
The thing is that the Catholics seem to, the Orthodox don't have original sin. So they're closer to Judaism in that sense, that there's two kind of, there's a tendency toward good and a tendency toward evil. And our ultimate place is freedom to choose. So we're neither good nor evil by nature, but we're created free and given the free choice between good and evil. Whereas in original sin, if I understand it right, Adam's first sin taints everyone afterwards, you see. But the Orthodox don't place as much emphasis on Jesus' death as both Protestants and Catholics do. And one of the monks, I have this relationship with this Greek Orthodox community in Boston that I've known for 50 years. I go there, and they've been very nice to me over the years, considering how I'm not really Orthodox. But they said, one of them said to me, it's not by his death we are saved, but by his life. So they think of the incarnation of his birth, his life, not his death, as being the main thing. You see what I mean? So it's not they don't believe in his death. It's just a different kind of emphasis.
One last thing, you said I guess it officially opened in 2014 because I was there before.
And they had the first.
And there were no lines before that. Maybe they were.
Yeah.
Maybe afterwards.
Yeah. When I first went there to 2008 or something, it was still a construction site. There was big plastic things hanging. You could see the facades, but the interior you just couldn't do it. You couldn't see it. Yes. Another question.
Hello. First of all, I want to thank you so much for the lecture. And you mentioned King Herod, I believe.
Yes.
And I just wanted to ask you, from my information, King Herod, and from his acts, was mentally not well, and also had real strong ties with Romans to please the Romans, for material gains and power. So I just wanted to bring that up. Rather than him being people who do things like that are, I believe, not well mentally.
Yeah, it's
you
a
know, rather than
psychopathic.
evil.
It's a psychopathic sort of rage that they're talking about. And also, I should point out, and I only found this out recently, is that Herod was not Jewish. I mean, he was a Jew. He converted to Judaism basically to get the power, because the Romans realized this guy will do what we say. You see, so that he was playing that game. Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just going to check in upstairs if there's any questions on Zoom up there.
Yes, we do. Here's one. The way that Gaudi structurally designed such a towering, complicated building is one of the most interesting things about it. It's shown to every architectural and engineering student at the very beginning of their education due to its elegance and simplicity, a simply brilliant way to determine a stable structure without using a huge amount of exceedingly complex calculations. Do you have any photos to share of the model he used?
Oh, at home, but not here. But yeah, the thing is, the models were destroyed by the anarchists and the communists when they went nuts with his, when they destroyed his studio in the 30s. So there's very little that survived that, you know. Yeah. Oh, there's a model there, but that's modern. I'm not sure. But what I'm talking about is 1937 or 1938. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Another question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful lecture. But I was just wondering, I know you're very busy, but could you come back and give us a talk on the Picasso Museum in Barcelona?
Oh, well, the Picasso Museum is great. But, there's a but there, Picasso Museum, he lived in Barcelona when he was really young. And he was a child prodigy. So they have drawings from when he's 12, and they look like Raphael. You know, he's really very skilled, even as a kid. But that Picasso Museum just has that early work. And then it has very late work, like when he was 80, and he's not very good when he's 80. He was great as a 12-year-old. His 80 is kind of, you know, messy. So that you kind of, there's no Cubist work, there's nothing from the 30s. So it's a very kind of lopsided picture. You get a Picasso from that. But there are these great like drawings by the 12-year-old Picasso. So it's fascinating in that sense. But in other, I'm actually doing a series at Teaneck Library. I get them mixed up. I do so many of them. But on Picasso. And one on the early, look at my website. You'll see there's an early one. I think we're doing it on Zoom too, so you could see it at home if you're interested in that.
Terrific. I
Yes,
see another couple
we
of
could
hands
probably
here.
use the microphone so people at home can get it.
I was there recently, and I was struck by how different some of the styles are.
Yeah.
And to me, there was a little bit of lack of harmony, and I wondered whether there were controversies or battle royales over each new project or each new style that was incorporated.
Yes.
Or how they reached some kind of a consensus.
Yeah, it was, it's been very, Subriac's facade has been very much criticized. But I like it. I like it a lot. But yeah, it's very stylistically different. But he knew that it was going to, he said it was based on bones. Instead of plants, it was going to be bone was going to be the idea behind it. And I think Subriac did a decent job of translating his stuff. And in fact, this Gaudi and his followers here have probably the most effect on Catholic art of the contemporary world of post-Vatican II Catholicism. This kind of style, this kind of semi-abstract style that comes from Gaudi kind of became a universal thing in the 60s and 70s for Catholics. Little missalettes and different things like that that are in this Gaudi style. So he really stamped his, you know, and he's much more usable than someone like Dali for the Catholics, you know, because it's more, it's not so out there, LSD trip kind of thing. It's more, you know, traditional.
Yeah, another question here.
Thank you. I don't intend to be flippant, and I know there's no literal connection between the terms Gaudi and Gaudi, but is there any similarity? Is there any part of his work that could be considered Gaudi?
Well, I don't consider it to be, overdone, but many modern architects in the 40s and 50s and 60s looked at this and said, this is a mess. Yeah. This is just all this stuff. And especially because I said, like, Crime and Ornament, by Adolf Loos, he says, it's decadent. It's related to degeneration of the brain. I mean, it's really strange. If he came and saw all my students have tattoos. I mean, they have tattoos coming up here and all over the place, which I never thought that would happen, but it did. So what's my point there? He tries to link crime and ornament. And obviously, this is very, very ornamental. So it has a kind of Baroque exuberance. If you go to Germany, some of these Baroque churches, they're just angels and plaster things and stucco all over the place. That's kind of a kind of aesthetic he has. He's like piling more and more and more and more on, so that it doesn't have that sleek, simple machine functionality that most modern architecture does. And because it's really part of that Art Nouveau. But Art Nouveau was very unfashionable during a certain part of the 20th century because they thought we've gone beyond this ornament. We're pure now. And this is very impure in that sense. He breaks dishes and sticks them into the cement, and it's very eclectic.
Thank you.
Vaguely Gothic, that has these spires. I wanted to mention another picture that I've seen is that he did a hanging version of it. Maybe you've seen that, made of cloth, so that weight would do this, and he was testing out certain things with this model that was upside down. Because he said it's kind of see if he turned it upside down, it was hanging. Yeah, it has that kind of anti-gravity thrust to make you feel like, it's just thrusting up like a plant, this magnificent thing.
Oh, more question here.
You just mentioned the plates and the, broken pottery. There's a gentleman in Cuba, in Havana, whose name is, I thought it was Ricardo Fuster, but his last name is Fuster. And he does the same thing, but he throws his own clay, or he makes ceramic tiles, breaks them, and then mounts them all over this little city. And it's just amazing.
This is
are there other examples of, this broken tile work?
Not that I'm aware of. It kind of reminds us of mosaic. And I'm not saying he used actual dishes. I think he actually had ceramic people working for him. But yeah, no, you don't see that anyplace else. It's a very kind of a strange aesthetic when you think about it. Like that salamander, with all the broken crockery. It's a very original idea. I wonder where he got that.
Yeah, one more question here.
Will the temple be finished once that last spire, or is there more to be done?
There's the facade, the glory facade on the front of the thing. Do I have a picture of that anywhere here? No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I thought of putting it in. But there's nothing much there. It's just kind of a blank, facade. It's facadeless. And they're going to do the ascension of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus and the assumption of Mary into heaven. I guess all those figures are going to be worked into this facade. I'm very anxious to see what actually comes out of it. Yeah, and that central spire, yeah. Originally, in 2014, they were saying 2026, but now they're saying 28. I don't know if I'll live to see the end of it, really, because it just seems to go on and on and on, and that's okay. I think it's okay to do that.
Well, Dennis, I think we'll have to commend you for. You could have taught a whole course, I think, right? On this, we I think only sort of scratched some of the surface of it. There's so much to this, and I think you've done a fantastic job today. So let's have another round of applause for Dennis Raverty.
Thank you.
And as I know we mentioned, just reminding everybody, Friday, January 17th, Dr. Raverty will be back, and we'll be looking at 19th century German painter Caspar David Friedrich.
Yeah, Caspar David Friedrich is one of the greatest of the German romantics. He's my very favorite of all the romantics in the 19th century. And his work is just, it's rare and it's not often brought together. The last time there was a major show was like 35 years ago, which I saw, but this is Friedrich again. He is not to be missed. So yeah,
there's an
definitely.
exhibit at the Met, I
There's
think
an exhibit at the
February
Met
through
opening
June.
in February. So this will be a preview of the Met show that you can see.
Yes.
Okay, so have a happy holiday and make it through this darkest night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thanks, everybody. Have a great holiday.